Los Angeles riots in 1992 did not happen in a vacuum. What became 6 days of civil unrest, destruction, and national soul searching was preceded by decades of accumulated tension, mistrust, and inequality. The sparks that ignited in late April of 1992, after the acquittal of four LAPD officers charged in the Rodney King beating, were lit against a backdrop of historical grievances and lived realities that many Angelenos, particularly African Americans, felt had been ignored or dismissed by institutions of power. To understand the riots, it's essential for us to unpack the background, the Rodney King incident itself, the legacy of LAPD community conflict, the economic and social strains of South Central Los Angeles, and the simmering racial tension between Black and Korean communities following the killing of Latasha Harlins. So each of these factors not only laid the foundation for what came in 1992, but also it revealed deeper fractures in American urban life. So the Rodney King beating was not just another act of police violence. So this was one of the first moments where technology forced the nation to confront in visual form what marginalized communities had long claimed. On March 3rd, 1991, after a high speed chase, Rodney King, a black motorist, was pulled over by LAPD officers. Instead of a standard arrest, he endured an extended and brutal beating, struck repeatedly with batons, kicked, and tasered, and the violence might have remained another local story had it not been for George Holliday, who was a bystander who filmed the incident from his apartment balcony. His video later broadcast worldwide showed King on the ground while officers continued to strike him even as he appeared subdued. For many Americans, particularly those outside Los Angeles, the tape was shocking, but for residents of South Central and other communities of color, it was it was less a revelation and more confirmation of what they already knew, that the LAPD often treated black and brown bodies with disregard, contempt, and outright violence. So criminal charges were brought against the officers and later civil proceedings had followed. Yet the fact that a beating so visceral, caught on film, even required such a contentious legal battle spoke volumes about how entrenched the defense of police behavior had become. The Rodney King incident was a flashpoint, but it wasn't the root. So, Los Angeles Police Department's history with minority communities was fraught long before 1991. So, during the 1980s and the early 1990s, the LAPD under Chief Daryl Gates developed a reputation for aggressive, militarized policing. And Gates himself was a polarizing figure, advocating tough on crime policies while often dismissing or downplaying the charges of racism and misconduct. Now, critics accuse the department of operating less like a community police force and more like an occupying army, especially in the black and Latino neighborhoods. Now, a pivotal document. Now, there was this document known as the Christopher Commission Report, formerly the Independent Commission on the LAPD, investigated the department in the wake of the King beating. Now, the report found widespread evidence of systemic problems, which was a pattern of excessive force, a culture of tolerance for misconduct, and a lack of accountability. It also noted racist attitudes within the ranks. Reforms such as civilian oversight were recommended, but change was slow and resisted. So the department's history was already marred by infamous moments, such as the 1965 Watts Rebellion, sparked by police abuse, which loomed large in memory, and the war on drugs that brought in SWAT raids and mass arrests, disproportionately targeting black Angelenos, and routine traffic stops often turned violent. So the environment of South Central Los Angeles in the late 20th century was one of grinding economic and social inequality. By the late 1980s, the neighborhood was marked by four problems. And those four problems were you had high unemployment, public service decline, the crack cocaine crisis, and concentrated poverty and segregation. So there were many industries that once sustained working class families had left the city. Manufacturing jobs declined, leaving behind a void that service sector work couldn't fill. And you had schools and the housing and healthcare that were underfunded, which further entrenching the cycles of poverty. And then the 1980s brought not only the devastating social consequences of addiction, but also aggressive policing and mass incarceration policies that disproportionately targeted black men. And then redlining and discriminatory housing policies had long confined African Americans to certain neighborhoods, creating a landscape of isolation and neglect. Now, these conditions here created a combustible atmosphere. The community felt abandoned by the economic system, demonized by the criminal justice system, and excluded from political decision making. So, alongside the LAPD community conflicts, there was also another fractured line that ran through South Central Los Angeles, and that was the tense relationship between the African American residents and the Korean immigrant store owners. On March 16, 1991, just 2 weeks after the Rodney King beating, 15-year-old Latasha Harlins entered a convenience store that was owned by Soon Jae-do, who was a Korean immigrant and she was accused of attempting to steal a bottle of orange juice. Harlan's she was fatally shot in the back of the head as she tried to leave the store, and the killing was actually captured on surveillance video. Now, Du was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, but the judge sentenced her to probation, community service, and a small fine, and there was no jail time for this. So, to the black community, this was another clear message that the justice system valued their lives less. And the contrast between the deadly response to a suspected theft and the leniency shown to the shooter filled outrage. So during the 1992 unrest, there were a lot of many Korean owned businesses that became targets of looting, and arson. And this wasn't only about Latasha Harlins, but years of tension between the store owners and the residents, the language barriers, the cultural misunderstandings, and the resentment over economic disparities. See, many black residents they felt disrespected or mistreated by Korean merchants, while Korean store owners they felt vulnerable to crime and unsupported by law enforcement. And there is one scene that I do want so there is so I do have an example that I do want to show you, and that is a scene that was actually shown in the movie known as Menace to Society. So in the movie Menace to Society, so you have two characters. You have two characters named Kane and his friend Odog. So both characters they enter a Korean owned corner store. And now this is short, but it's an explosive interaction. So this is more than just cinematic violence. Like it's a dramatized microcosm of a real historical conflict. Now, in this, when Kane and Oda, when they step into the store, the Korean shopkeeper and his wife, they follow them around. So the wife, she followed them around suspiciously, watching their every move. And this is a familiar and humiliating experience for many young black men in urban America during that time, being profiled as potential thieves or as criminals the moment that they enter an establishment. Now, Odog, he noticed the suspicious gaze, and the tension grows rapidly. And then when the lady, the wife, she mutters under her breath about, hurry up and buy. So it signals not only impatience, but also a lack of cultural understanding or respect. So Odog perceives this as dehumanizing, and the situation escalates to deadly violence. And the reason why this matters historically and why I bring this up is because this is not simply about two individuals. It reflects an ongoing pattern of mutual mistrust between two racialized communities living side by side, but worlds apart economically, socially, and culturally. And during the late 1970s, during the late 1970s and the 1980s, there were many Korean immigrants that that often were facing limited job prospects and barriers to upward mobility. Established, small businesses in predominantly black neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So these were often liquor stores, convenience shops, and beauty supply stores. For black residents, these businesses were both a necessary resource and a symbol of economic exclusion. See, many African Americans they felt locked out of business ownership in their own communities. At the same time, Korean merchants often operated on thin profit margins in communities, struggling with unemployment, with the crime, and disinvestment. So this dynamic created a transactional relationship without trust, and language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and stereotypes on both sides compounded the problem. Now, I will say this: the tragedy of Latasha Harlins adds another layer to this history, a reminder that racial conflict in America isn't only a black and white binary. So the targeting of Korean businesses during the riots reveals how interethnic tensions fueled by systemic inequality can pit communities against each other rather than against the structures that marginalize them both. And it is heartbreaking to see that, to see how a 15-year-old girl's death became both a symbol of injustice and a fault line between neighbors. So by the time that the officers in the Rodney King trial were acquitted in April 1992, Los Angeles was already a city on edge. So the video of King's beating had exposed police brutality. You had the Christopher Commission that had confirmed systemic corruption, and the economic conditions of South Central created desperation. And the death of Latasha Harlins showed the fragility of justice and interethnic trust. Now, the legal sequence that sparked the riots. So the first we have the state trial in Simi Valley. Now, following the widely circulated video showing that unprovoked beating of Rodney King by the LAPD officers, public pressure had mounted for accountability. Now, the LAPD officers that were charged, you had officers known as Stacy Kuhn, Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wynn, and Theodore Brazino. They saw all four men face state level criminal charges of assault and excessive use of force. However, though, the decision to hold the trial in Simi Valley, which Simi Valley, a suburban area with a predominantly white and relatively affluent jury pool, had profound implications. So, this venue choice, approved by the court, will later be seen as a critical factor in the trial's outcome. So, the trial concluded on April 29th, with the jury acquitting three officers on all counts and deadlocking on a single count against the fourth officer. So, despite the videotaped evidence, which clearly showed repeated strikes and apparent excessive police force, the verdict was widely perceived as a miscarriage of justice. The reasoning offered by the jury centered on their interpretation of the threat that King allegedly posed and the officer's perception of danger. To many observers, however, this justification was attainable, given the visual evidence of King being beaten while largely immobilized. Now, from a societal perspective, the acquittals illuminated the deep racial and systemic disparities within the American legal system. The perception that predominantly white jurors could not fairly adjudicate a case involving black victims and police officers reinforced long-standing mistrust between communities of color and law enforcement institutions. And for many in Los Angeles, particularly in South Central and surrounding neighborhoods, the verdict was the immediate catalyst for the riots that erupted that night, reflecting a profound sense of injustice and the belief that the legal system had failed to protect black citizens from state-sanctioned violence. And the legal narrative, it didn't end with the state trial. So, under the U.S. law, the dual sovereignty doctrine allows for separate state and federal prosecutions for the same act without violating double jeopardy protections. Recognizing the civil rights violations implicit in the beating, federal prosecutors pursue charges under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code, which criminalizes the deprivation of civil rights under color of law. In 1993, two officers, Sergeant Stacy Kuhn and Lawrence Powell, were both convicted in federal court of violating Rodney King's civil rights. And these convictions demonstrated that even when state level prosecutions fail, the federal system can act as a mechanism for accountability. Importantly, these proceedings were distinct in both legal rationale and societal perception, whereas the state trial centered on assault and the interpretation of immediate threat. The federal prosecution focused on the broader constitutional violation, the denial of King's civil rights, the irrespective of the circumstances of police judgment. However, even these convictions, even they did little to assuage the anger that had already ignited widespread unrest. For many, the federal convictions coming after the fact could not retroactively undo the perception of systemic injustice that the state trial had crystallized. And the juxtaposition of the state acquittals and the federal convictions underscores a central tension in the American justice system, the gap between legal technicality and moral accountability. Now, the acquittals occurring in a venue detached from the community most affected signaled to residents that the legal system could fail them in the most glaring circumstances. And the subsequent federal convictions, although important, they arrived too late to prevent the eruption of collective outrage. So, in analyzing this sequence, it becomes clear that the riots were not merely a reaction to law enforcement brutality, but also to a perceived failure of legal legitimacy. When laws exist to protect citizens but fail in practice due to systemic biases, the resulting social unrest is both predictable and rational from the perspective of those directly harmed. And I also will say this, but this period, it makes me consider how justice must be both substantive and procedural. A fair trial is not just about legal technicalities, but also about optics, context, and the perceived equity of the system. The Rodney King case shows how a misalignment in these areas can ignite societal fault lines. And the Simi Valley trial is a painful reminder that legality alone does not equate to legitimacy in the eyes of the community. And right now, what we have here is we have the timeline and the major events that took place day by day. So, March 3rd, 1991, Rodney King is stopped, he's chased and beaten by LAPD officers, and a video by George Holliday appears on local news. And then July through November 1991, you have the Christopher Commission report that goes from July 1991, which criticizes the LAPD excessive force, and the King case proceeds through state investigation and indictment processes. And then we have April 29th, 1992. So the jury in Simi Valley acquitted the four officers nearly entirely, and within hours, protests erupt in South Central and other neighborhoods, and the violence escalates that evening. And the mayor this time, Tom Bradley, denounces the verdict. And then April 29th through May 4th. So 5 days, days 1 through 5. So in these 5 days that you see here, there were looting, there were arson, attacks on civilians and businesses, which Koreatown was heavily affected by this. And then firefighting overwhelmed, sniping and shootings on the streets, incidents of citizen self-defense, many armed Koreans defending their shops, repeated clashes with the police, thousands were arrested, and the California National Guard was mobilized. And you had Governor Pete Wilson, who requested federal assistance. You had President George H.W. Bush, who federalized the California National Guard under the Insurrection Act and authorized federal troops and federal law enforcement assistance. And you had the Joint Task Force that Los Angeles had formed. So by May 4th through May 5th, there were large deployments of National Guard and federal troops to help suppress the major public disorder. And Rodney King, he even gave a televised plea for peace. And the line and the line itself, known as, "Can't we all get along?" on May 1st, 1992. So after May 4th, 1992, the curfews still remained. There was cleanup, investigation, and legal reviews that proceeded, and federal prosecutions of officers followed in 1993, and civil suits resulted in settlements, rebuilding, and community recovery. All became a long-term process. So this is the timeline and the major events that transpired during these last 5 days in this event. So the scale of the riots. Now there were a lot that happened in the LA riot. So when it comes to what happened, we have the casualties from the deaths and the injuries. Now official uh, contemporaneous records and historical recounts consistently report that the death toll from the riots ranged from 53 to 63 people, reflecting slight discrepancies among different sources. And these fatalities were concentrated primarily in South Central Los Angeles, where confrontations between the rioters, the residents, and law enforcement were most intense. And the deaths resulted from a combination of gunfire, arson, assaults, and accidental causes, such as traffic related incidents amidst the chaos. In addition to these deaths, there are also approximately 2,300 people that were reported injured during the riots, and injuries range from minor wounds sustained during the looting or the clashes to severe trauma caused by firearms, beatings, and fires. And the hospitals in Los Angeles were overwhelmed with patients, revealing the extent to which the city's infrastructure was strained during the unrest. And many injuries were compounded by delayed medical response times, and as emergency services were stretched thin while responding to the fires, the crimes in progress, and law enforcement operations. Now, from a personal perspective, these numbers are staggering. Each death and injury represents a life disrupted, a family affected, and a community that was scarred. And the sheer scale also highlights how civil unrest, while it was politically and socially motivated, it carries profound human costs that extend far beyond the immediate headlines. And then we have the arrests. Now, the law enforcement response during this time, during the riots, was massive and chaotic, reflecting the city's initial underestimation of the unrest's severity. Now, roughly 11,000 to 12,000 people were arrested, according to NBC Los Angeles and other historical sources. Now, arrests encompassed a wide array of offenses, including looting, assault, arson, vandalism, and resisting police orders. However, though, these arrests were often reactive rather than preventive due to the rapid spread of rioting across neighborhoods. Police and National Guard forces faced criticism for their delayed interventions in some areas and overly aggressive tactics in other areas. Now, once again, many of these arrests were made in Koreatown, where the concentration of the small businesses made the district a hotspot for looting and property destruction. And from an analytical standpoint, these figures reveal both the scale of civil disobedience and the immense challenge of maintaining order in densely populated urban areas during a large scale riot. And the property damage. Now, the economic toll of the riots is perhaps it's the most visually and historically documented aspect of the unrest, because the estimates for property damage range from 800 million to 1 billion, a figure that encompasses looted businesses, burned buildings, destroyed personal property. So thousands of businesses were looted, with hundreds of structures set ablaze, including the shops, the warehouses, and the private homes. And Koreatown suffered disproportionate losses, as many businesses were owned by Korean Americans who faced targeted attacks due to racial tensions and their prominence as neighborhood entrepreneurs. And the material destruction had long lasting consequences. So, beyond the immediate economic loss, the riots accelerated the business closures, disinvestment in affected neighborhoods, and heightened tensions among racial and ethnic groups in Los Angeles. Insurance claims, rebuilding efforts, and municipal recovery programs took years to implement fully. Now, from a personal lens, the scale of this property damage underscores the profound interconnection between the social unrest and economic destabilization. And it's a reminder that violence in response to systemic injustice can simultaneously expose inequities and perpetuate cycles of hardship for those least able to absorb such losses. Now, speaking of speaking of the scale of this riot, who exactly were involved? So, the riot participants. Now, the participants in the LA riots were not a monolithic group, but a wide cross section of the city's residents, reflecting its diversity in race, socioeconomic status, and motivations. Local residents were directly affected, where you had, with the African American communities, disproportionately impacted, both in terms of casualties and property loss. However, Latino, Asian, and white residents were also involved in multiple capacities as victims, bystanders, or even active participants. And you also even had people that were opportunistic looters who exploited the chaos, engaging in theft and vandalism with little or no political motivation. And also, you had a particularly notable group, and once again, the Korean shop owners in South Central Los Angeles, who became emblematic of localized community defense. And many of them armed themselves and organized neighborhood watches to protect their businesses, responding to what they perceived as inadequate protection from the police. And scholarship emphasizes that the unrest cannot be reduced to a simple racial confrontation between Black and Korean residents. See, Black, Latino, and Asian and other community members participated in multiple sometimes contradictory ways as rioters, looters, victims, or defenders. And then you also had the LAPD and other police. So the Los Angeles Police Department was a central actor in both the lead up and unfolding of the riots. See, officers were tasked with crowd control and maintaining order, but their response was widely criticized as slow, poorly coordinated, and at times ineffective. And the aftermath of the riots revealed a lot of systemic losses, issues within the LAPD, with the Christopher Commission established to investigate the department after the Rodney King beating highlighted significant institutional problems, including the inadequate leadership, the flawed training protocols, and the entrenched cultural norms that discouraged accountability. And then you had the state and the federal actors. Now, the response to these riots extended beyond local authorities because you had Governor Pete Wilson and Mayor Tom Bradley that both played crucial roles in deploying the California National Guard, while President George H.W. Bush, he authorized the federal troop involvement and additional law enforcement resources. And the Pentagon, they activated joint tasking, coordinating federal resources to support local authorities. And these interventions were not without controversy because, as the critics debated the proportionality, the timing, and the potential long term implications of militarized responses to civil unrest. And you had the media and you had videotape. So the media, they played a dual role in both exposing and shaping the events of the LA riots. So the broadcast of King's beating, captured by George Holliday, became a defining image that galvanized public outrage. Uh, and the television networks, they provided live coverage of the riots, allowing the audiences nationwide to witness the unfolding chaos in real time. And this coverage amplified awareness, influencing public perception and political responses. And you even had scholars that noted that the media not only documented events, but also framed the narrative, sometimes sensationalizing the violence and reinforcing particular interpretations of who the actors, who they were, and what motivations that they held. So the live broadcasting of the looting, the arson, and confrontations created a feedback loop. Viewers became participants in a mediated sense, shaping public sentiment and political pressure. Now, the root causes and the contributing factors to all of this. So once again, this was not a single cause event because there were a lot that happened in all this. So you had everything with the immediate legal trigger. And the immediate trigger was the Simi Valley verdict on April 29th, 1992, which acquitted and failed to convict the officers involved in the beating of Rodney King. And you had the evidence of police brutality because the evidence that because the evidence that came from the videotape by Holiday made perceptions of the police violence incontrovertible to many, and that evidence shaped public anger and the long-term structural inequalities. See, you had decades of disinvestment, high unemployment, poor schools, and the crack epidemic had concentrated poverty and frustration in South Central and adjacent neighborhoods, and economic grievance made the community more susceptible to mass unrest and the racial and interethnic tensions. So there were strained relations between the black communities and the Korean American merchants, exemplified by once again Latasha Harlin's case and other intergroup and other intergroup frictions that helped turn some of the violence towards small businesses in Koreatown. But scholarship stresses the complexity. Latino and other communities were also involved and they were affected by this. And the policing and institutional failure. The LAPD's history of excessive force, weak civilian oversight, and a troubled leadership environment meant the department's capacity to prevent escalation was compromised. And the department was slow to deploy resources and coordinate with other agencies during the worst nights. And you also had the catalytic social dynamics. So the rumor, the group behavior, and the opportunistic crime combined with real protest to produce the rapid escalation. The city's emergency services were overwhelmed, Firefighters could not respond rapidly to many arson incidents, which multiplied property losses. So, the official and legal aftermath. So, the civil and federal prosecutions. Now, the federal civil rights charges later resulted in convictions of some officers. So Rodney King received a civil settlement from the city of Los Angeles. So he later received a $3.8 million settlement in a civil suit against the city. And the Christopher Commission in 1991 and the reforms. The Commission's 1991 report premised on systemic problems in the LAPD, recommended changes, including improved oversight and accountability. In the wake of the riots, there were additional calls for reforms, new civilian oversight mechanisms, and changes in the LAPD policies, though many critics argue that the reforms were partial and unevenly implemented. And the economic recovery and the settlement. The city and the state allocated funds for rebuilding. Some victims and business store owners obtained insurance or civil settlements, but there were many businesses, especially the small town Korean-owned stores, were permanently closed, and community redevelopment was uneven. And studies even later showed the persistent economic disparities in many impacted neighborhoods and the policy debates. So the riots renewed national debate about policing, race relations, urban poverty, and the role of the federal versus local authority in domestic unrest, and debates that have reemerged in subsequent incidents of police violence. And ladies and gentlemen, that overall concludes this video here today. So the Los Angeles riots of 1992, ignited by the acquittal of the four officers involved in the beating of Rodney King, were not merely a spontaneous eruption of anger. They were the culmination of decades of systemic racial, economic, and social tensions that had long plagued the city. And while the images of the burning buildings, the looting, and the violent confrontations dominate the popular memory of the riots, the deeper historical significance lies in what they revealed about the fractured social fabric of Los Angeles and more broadly, urban America. So, at the core of the riots was a profound sense of injustice. African American communities, particularly in South Central Los Angeles, had endured a persistent cycle of poverty, unemployment, underfunded schools, and aggressive policing. Now, the beating of Rodney King and the subsequent acquittal of the officers, despite clear video evidence, became a symbolic validation of systemic oppression. And this was not an isolated incident. See, it echoed the countless other instances of discrimination and state sanctioned violence. The riots were a stark, painful reminder that when citizens perceive a consistent denial of justice, social unrest becomes inevitable. So, the aftermath of the riots revealed both the fragility and the resilience of the city. Over 60 lives were lost, thousands were injured, and property damage exceeded $1 billion, disproportionately affecting minority owned businesses. Yet, amidst the destruction, there were efforts of solidarity and rebuilding because you had grassroots organizations, local leaders, and community members mobilized to provide relief, advocate for reform, and address the underlying social issues that had festered for decades. And this duality, destruction paired with the community with community resilience, highlights a critical lesson. Social unrest is both a symptom of deep systemic failure and a catalyst for potential change if channeled constructively. Now, from a historical perspective, the LA riots also forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about race relations, economic inequality, and policing in urban America. They sparked national debates about the militarization of law enforcement, the role of media in shaping narratives, and the importance of community engagement in preventing violence. Now, for Los Angeles itself, the riots led to the Christopher Commission, which investigated the LAPD practices and recommended reforms. And though the progress was slow and uneven, The riots, therefore, stand as both a warning and a call to action, a reminder that justice delayed or denied can stabilize entire communities. And on a personal level, reflecting on these riots, it evokes a complex mix of sorrow, frustration, and cautious hope. Because to me, it's heartbreaking to witness a community driven to violence by injustice, yet impossible to ignore the legitimacy of the grievances that fueled such an eruption. And the riots forced me to confront the enduring legacies of the structural inequality in my own society, like even today in my own society, and challenge me to consider the roles that individuals, institutions, and policies that can play in fostering equity and accountability. And it's a reminder that progress is not automatic. It requires vigilance, empathy, and sustained action to prevent the kind of systemic breakdown that led to the chaos of 1992. Ultimately, the LA riots were a historical inflection point. They crystallized the consequences of systemic neglect and racial inequality while demonstrating the capacity for community resilience and reform. So the legacy of this, their legacy continues to resonate today in conversations about police accountability, urban policy, and social justice movements. So the study of the riots is not only to examine the past, but to learn enduring lessons about the consequences of injustice, the necessity of civic engagement, and the moral imperative to address inequities before they erupt into catastrophe.